Well, hi everyone. This is I guess the first lecture, the first video I want to give for RS3350. I guess special topics, studies in the New Testament, or introduction, I guess, to the New Testament. My name is Glenn Farron, but please, on emails, don't hesitate to call me Glenn. I guess just a little background, since it is sort of the first class. I'm a PhD. I've got my doctorate from the University of Alberta in 2015. My area of specialization is early Christian history and method and theory in the study of religion. I did also do undergraduate work at the University of Regina. So again, if you're seeing this from El Paso, you probably, it's way up north, just go straight. You'll probably bang into it at some point. Just another thing to keep in mind, this is a class on New Testament, early Christian origins, but be aware that we're not approaching this stuff with any kind of religious bent. It's one of the things that when I do these kinds of classes, I've been accused numerous times of not taking anything seriously, and that is actually a very accurate accusation. In particular, I do not take the claims of Christianity, any other religion, as being accurate or serious. I do take the study of them quite seriously, but the actual claims themselves, that is not something that we do in a course like this. Again, I've been noted to be heretical, blasphemous, disrespectful, what have you. I've always taken that as a compliment. So just kind of be in mind that this is not a class on the theology or reification of say, the New Testament, but of a critical inquiry and a critical study of that. Okay, so as we go through the lectures, I should point out that if you jump to, well, if you see from the first lecture slide, you'll note a picture of Buddy Christ from Dogma, the old Jay and Silent Bob movie. That is kind of the approach I have always taken when it comes to this stuff. So if you would jump to the next slide, I'm going to try to sync up my lectures to the slides that I presented. This is from a scholar named Bruce Lincoln, something he does called Thesis on Method, and it is available. There's a link on the slide if you wish to download it and have it with you. It is a page and a half. It is a very short little summary on how folks in religious studies go about doing their work. Okay, so anyway, the quote that I wanted to draw your attention to is that reverence is a religious and not a scholarly virtue. When good manners and good conscience cannot be reconciled, the demands of the latter ought to prevail. So if we are approaching this topic from a very historical, critical perspective, if we come across something that may seem as disrespectful or may go against some element of reverence somebody might have to the material, that's fine. That's what scholars do. Our job isn't to protect a religious tradition, be it Christianity, Islam, Judaism, what have you, but to offer inquiries of it and to investigate it thoroughly. Okay? So just sort of keep that in mind as we are jumping through the material. So just a little bit of background on sort of the context in which we're looking at the New Testament. Now considering, oh, maybe it's a stretch, I don't know, but considering that probably most of us are familiar or live within a North American context, I'll make the assumption right off the top that I think, I'm going to guess, that a lot of us are familiar with some kind of Christianity, either as a Christian or have friends or acquaintances, family members that are also Christians, or that you happen to live in a very Christian-centric context. I mean, in North America, you cannot avoid it. It is sort of the superstructure of how the world, or how our world works. So I will assume that most of us have a passing familiarity with sort of the power chords of what constitutes Christianity. So terms like Jesus, gospel, Bible, church, etc. Shouldn't be unfamiliar to you, which in a class like this has some serious advantages, but also has some really problematic disadvantages. So if you do have some knowledge of Christianity, what I want you to do is, as we walk through this material, I kind of want you to empty your head of all of that stuff. Okay, I want you to kind of put it aside, at least for now, and everything you think you know about Christianity, I want you to put it in the back burner, and I want you to approach the literature of the New Testament and some of the stuff that didn't make the New Testament. That's also equally as important as if you had never heard of Christianity before, which can be hard. I should mention I come from a pretty Christian-centric background. I grew up in a relatively Christian heavy home. And you will no doubt hear anecdotes from when I was a child. But when I really think about Christianity and the stuff that I learned in church as a kid and a teen, it strikes me as an incredibly weird religion. Of course, it's hard to see this, right? Because we are incredibly familiar with this stuff in one form or another, either practicing it or living in a cultural context where Christianity is everywhere, despite what we've been told on Fox News and things like that. There is no war on Christianity. I always joke that, you know, how hard it must be to be a Christian in North America, you poor babies. But anyway, that seems... but the weirdness of Christianity probably seems less so, simply because we have naturalized many of the norms that it holds to. Indeed, if you've ever taken another religious studies class, even this weirdness gets underplayed, because a lot of the categories that we use for Christianity are simply not, or simply are part of the, I don't know, theoretical framework of what gets to be religious studies. So things like faith, belief, these tend to be understood as sort of primary elements of what it is to be religious, and they really are not, at least not in the sense that we think they are. I mean, those ideas being central to a religious tradition really have grown up out of the Protestant Reformation, and probably only a religion as we see it in the last couple hundred years. So to apply that to the ancient world in which our literature comes from is somewhat problematic, and it's something that I certainly want you to take into consideration, that a lot of the stuff when we talk about it may seem familiar, but I hope that we can denaturalize it a little bit. So, for instance, unlike a lot of other traditions, for instance, Christianity has been and still is a religion based on belief. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that Christians aren't expected to do things, but the emphasis on Christianity is on faith and on doctrine, and the basic route to religious goals, salvation, what have you, is through this assertion of belief in Christian teachings. Okay, so that should seem pretty straightforward. Now, what are these doctrines in a nutshell? Well, while there are, of course, competing versions of what gets to be quote-unquote proper Christianity, in our modern world, in a nutshell, we can make some general assumptions, I think, that cover most of what modern and probably quite a few ancient Christianities believed. And it's pretty straightforward and pretty simple, at least at first blush. Okay, so here's a summary of Christianity using more or less Christian-centric language. So human beings, say, are stained by original sin. They need God's forgiveness. God loves humans in spite of this, and so he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die as atonement for human sin. As a result, those who have faith in Christ can have their sins forgiven and ultimately will receive salvation from God, and again, however salvation happens to be imagined. Okay, so this probably makes some sense to us growing up within this context. But when you think about it, if you try to pull yourself out of the Christian-centered context, it actually doesn't make a lot of sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer another description of this basic doctrine, but this time without using sort of Christian theological lingo, I guess. And here's how someone looking at Christianity from the outside might describe the religion. So please, if you jump to slide 3. So first off, you suck. You suck so bad that God should hate you and crush you like the bug you are. God, however, because he felt like it, created a loophole, essentially a trick, to allow him to love you in spite of the fact that you don't deserve it. And this is the trick. He arranged to have himself turned into a human being and have himself tortured to death. This is the punishment that you, as a human who sucks, actually deserved. But since it has now been discharged, you don't need to be punished this way. Therefore, if you believe God did this, he will love you and reward you accordingly. Okay? Now, I am going to assume that this description is one that most Christians, I would say probably all Christians, would not hold to. They would probably say that it does not accurately describe or represent their faith in any way, shape, or form. But the point, I think, is that it nicely destabilizes Christianity, how it's been represented, at least how it's sort of been given as a way of belief in North American culture. Okay, so that's something I want you to think about. So if you jump to the next slide, which I believe is slide 4. Let me see, is it slide 4? Yes, sorry. Slide 4. And this is again from Bruce Lincoln. This is the 13th thesis on method. When one permits those who one studies to define the terms in which they will be understood, suspends one's interest in the temporal and contingent, or fails to distinguish between truths, truth claims, and regimes of truth, one has ceased to function as a historian or a scholar. In that moment, a variety of roles are available, some perfectly respectable, collector, friend, and advocate, and some less appealing, cheerleader, voyeur, and retailer of imported goods. None, however, should be confused with scholarship. Now, my point is, however, that when Christianity is looked from the outside, when we try to look at it from a somewhat denaturalized position, it looks awfully weird. And from the point of view of many of those who were Christian in the ancient world, as represented by the literature, this kind of thing would look awfully weird too. This sort of denaturalization. Now, I should point out that there is, seriously competing versions of Christianity in the ancient world. We will cover them as we suss through the material. But be aware that this sort of narrative, this sort of myopic view, may be true for some Christianities in antiquity and in the modern world, but isn't necessarily the only way in which people could have been Christian, for lack of a better word, back at the time of our literature. Okay? But let's then look quickly at this weird, not weird narrative and kind of deconstruct where it comes from as sort of a first step in disembedding this standard gospel narrative that you might have perhaps been exposed to, and perhaps this will allow us to get a better handle on the material. All right. So if you jump to slide 5, so this is a quote from a scholar named Burton Mack. Basically, he calls this the Big Bang theory of Christian origin. So, according to the Christian imagination, Christianity began when Jesus entered the world, performed miracles, called disciples, taught them about the kingdom of God, challenged the Jewish establishment, was crucified as the Christ and Son of God, appeared after his resurrection, overwhelmed his disciples with his Holy Spirit, established the first church in Jerusalem, and sent his apostles out on a mission to tell the world what they had seen and heard. Telling what they had seen was enough to convince the Jews to convert and the Gentiles into thinking that God had planned the whole thing in order to start a new religion. The new religion was about sin and redemption. What it took to start the new religion was all there as a kind of divine implantation in the life of Jesus, needing only to germinate and develop as early Christians heard about it, believed it, and came to understand its import. We might call this scenario the Big Bang concept of Christian origins. Now, you might be wondering where this idea came from, and the answer is, of course, we get it from some, but not all, of the texts that we will cover under the rubric of the New Testament. But perhaps more importantly, this idea comes from somehow of the texts, not so much what the texts say on their own, but how they have been collected and put together, how they have been canonized within this collection that we call the New Testament. Essentially, this narrative then comes from the text, but also how they were spun in such a way to give us this narrative, to give us the impression that we have this coherent discourse about how early Christianity began. And this narrative spin is called, conveniently, the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is, of course, part of the canon. If you would jump to slide 6, the New Testament is part of the canon. Canon just means, for the purposes of our class, a set in stone collection of writings that cannot be removed, but more importantly, cannot be added to. So we have this quite demarcated collection of literature that we are told is the best example of early Christianity. And for all intents and purposes, it is locked in stone. There's no way of adding to it, despite the fact that other texts have been discovered that could be added to this. As I think I've already noted, though, Christianity also accepts as part of their canon the Jewish Bible, which is known as the Tanakh. This is part of the canon as well. Christians call it the Old Testament or the Old Covenant because, of course, in the narrative of Christian origins, the New Testament is the new way of looking at this revelation. So it supersedes the Old Testament. So right within the terms themselves, you get a sense of where they happen to stand. Of course, folks who are Jewish do not see it as the Old Testament. It is, the only covenant that actually makes sense. Now, the texts which describe this new revelation, as I said, are appropriately enough called the New Testament. That just means the new covenant or a new agreement with God that supersedes or fulfills the old one. Now, the New Testament is a body of texts that were composed in Greek, Koine Greek in particular, that were written starting from around 50 CE or 50 AD, to the last one being written perhaps around 150 CE or AD. So the first ones were written about 20 years after the after the death of the figure of Jesus, apparently. If we're going to take that narrative seriously, then yes, after 20 years after Jesus had apparently died, the first literature was actually written. And the last kind of stuff was written not until about a century after. So we have this long period of time in which, the main character of our narrative had left the stage before the actual story got written down. So the point of that is that we are not dealing in any way, shape, or form with eyewitness accounts. Okay, these are not sort of journalistic renderings of what happened in the ancient world. Now, many of the New Testament texts themselves claim to tell the story of the origin of this movement, this idea of Christianity, but of course we are not dealing here with straightforward factual history. The way that scholars kind of think about it is we're dealing with sacred histories, mythic beginnings of something, even though they are presented to us as if they were eyewitness accounts. Now, that doesn't mean they're useless in any way, shape, or form. Far from it. Like any other mythic text, and I'm kind of riffing on our textbook by Burton Mack here, these stories we find in the Christian New Testament. While they are not history, they are, though, how that group perceived itself. So they're an interesting snapshot of the time in which they were written and then preserved, gives us a sense of what the people who held them to be true or held them to be meaningful would have saw themselves. Okay, so in a way, these texts are reinventing the past, setting it in a nostalgic kind of frame to talk about the context in which they were written in. So you have this sort of interesting narrative elements going on. And again, I want to point out that this mythic element is not just found in the text that we call the New Testament. This should be applied to all material that we're looking at, both the New Testament and the stuff that doesn't make the cut. We'll be looking at some of the texts that didn't make the New Testament, so something like the Gospel of Thomas, or some really interesting texts like the Apocryphon of John, one with a crazy name called the Hypostasis of the Archons. These things are Christian for all intents and purposes, but for one reason or another, they did not make the cut. Now, it doesn't mean that they were like a truth that was suppressed or something like that. They were just a different narrative, and we're trying to promote a different point of view. Okay? Anyway, so here's a quick summary of the New Testament, the collected sources that are the prime culprit for the Big Bang Theory. So I should point out that, of course, many of the New Testament texts presuppose that the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, was part of the narrative. I should point out that the Tanakh is essentially this mythic history of the people who were known as the Hebrews, who later became known as the Israelites, Jews, Judeans, that kind of thing. It sort of discusses their trials and tribulations of how they move through history. Kind of like the Iliad, but with King David instead. And again, it details this mythic understanding of how the God of the Israelite people, Yahweh, interacted and dealt with them throughout their history, or their perceived mythical history. All right. So the texts in what is the New Testament not only follow the Hebrew Bible in its narrative, and their placement within the Christian Bible. So you have the Hebrew Bible coming first, and the New Testament coming after, and it looks like it's a coherent narrative. It was put together that way intentionally by the people who codified these things, but also the New Testament anticipates things in the Old Testament. It was written, the various texts were written with the Old Testament certainly in mind. There's tons of references to it in the New Testament, and in a lot of cases, elements of the New Testament literature seem to be framed as fulfilling certain elements that we'd have in the Hebrew Bible. So, for instance, Jesus, in various and sundry ways, is portrayed as the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible, and according to the folks who wrote these texts, he is the answer to the question that was posed within the Tanakh. Okay? So, again, the Hebrew Bible is sort of presupposed to follow the Christian literature. And again, I use terms like Christian quite loosely. At this point in the history that we're looking at, these folks do not see themselves as being Christian or as being all that radically distinct from, say, their contemporary Judeans or Jews of the time. They saw themselves generally as writing extra texts that would be Jewish, for lack of a better word. Not that they were trying to fulfill Judaism or trying to subvert it or negate it, but as sort of a way of correcting what they would have saw as problems at the time. So up until probably the 2nd or 3rd century, we really don't have Christianity. We have a sect of Jewish thought that was on par with the Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, you name it. They would have been seen as almost like a political party within the landscape of the Judeans. So again, they seem to would have had some sort of nostalgic link with the history of these so-called Hebrews. Okay? Now, in a lot of the ways that we're going to be talking about this stuff, I tend to say religion, and I put it up in quotes. What I want us to think about is that the term religion is something that is somewhat contested as well. What we have in the ancient world is not the same as what we would have it now. We don't think of religion in the same way as people in antiquity would have done. So, for instance, going to an election, for instance. In contemporary discourse, modern Western world, an election of a political government is seen as fundamentally not religious. Or when you think about how it's supposed to be portrayed in both the United States and Canada, what we have is a separation of church and state. State is different from religion. In the ancient world, voting would have been seen as a religious event, as, say, going to a temple, right? Where we would say going to a temple or a church is primary, here's a religious thing, voting would be something separate. In the ancient world, no, they did not make that distinction. In fact, instead of calling it religion, a better way of translating these kinds of terms would have been something like the traditions of the ancestors, or considering that we're in a very patriarchal context, traditions of the fathers. So I would follow the religion of my ancestors. Okay, so if I was a Judean, I would follow the traditions of the Judeans, because that is what somebody did. Much like people who are Roman follow the traditions of the Romans, the Syrians, the Egyptians, all these other kinds of groups. Okay. Now, of course, how the various Christians represented in the New Testament followed what they understood as the traditions of the Judeans is, say, different, of course, in Sadducees, Pharisees, the other sort of parties of the time. But for them, at least, it wasn't something necessarily new or novel or distinct from what was Jewish. Again, you'll see it when we go through the literature. They talk about Jews as this somehow they are the other, they're the villain. But the way scholars have kind of reframed this discourse, it's kind of like a member of a political party kind of dissing another member of the same community, but from a different political party. So, in the United States, you have Republicans and Democrats not necessarily seeing themselves eye to eye. In Canada, we have a variety of political parties that have been doing that as well. So that's not to say they're not Canadian or American, but they have a very different view of this, okay? And I also want to stress that this use of terms Jewish, Christian, Judaism, whatever, do not denote a religion. As I said, these are more the traditions of the fathers of whatever mythic history they happen to be affiliating. Okay, so I mean, for our own purposes, we'll call them Christianity or Judaism. But I want you to be aware that I put quotes around them, and there's little footnotes, and then there's all this sort of qualifiers, because they are not the same thing as what we have today. Judaism and Christianity 2,000 years ago was definitely not the same as how it's understood today, okay? Even though we're kind of stuck with these kinds of terms, okay? All right, so with all that qualifications out of the way, let's jump to the first sort of element. So we will jump to slide 7. So here we have the texts that are actually in the New Testament. I want you to be aware with what we are actually dealing with. Now, the New Testament itself has a variety of genres within it. We have Gospels, we have letters, we have an act or a pseudo-history. We have something called an apocalypse, which is, again, a kind of a literary genre of the time. So, the New Testament itself opens with 4 different versions of the story of the life of Jesus, the supposed founder of Christianity. And these sort of stories are called the Gospels, for lack of a better word. And gospel just means, well, the term is in Greek is euangelion, this idea of sort of calling out, I guess, or the declaring of this good news. And again, I should point out that these are not the only Gospels that were composed talking about Jesus. There were many more that simply did not make the cut, and we will be covering some of them, like the Gospel of Thomas, which is one that perhaps you may have heard of, but there was Gospels attributed to the figure of Philip. There was Gospels attributed to Mary Magdalene, which are quite fascinating. And I think there's something like 20 texts that are called Gospels floating around, but only these 4 are the ones that actually made the cut of the New Testament. So anyway, none of the Gospels, as I said, are in fact historically accurate depictions of any real person, in this case, the person of Jesus. As I said, these are mythic and legendary portrayals of a semi-divine figure. And the author of all these Gospels were not interested, as I said, from a journalistic account of what really happened, but were more interested in making theological, or I guess we could say religious points in the form of stories about Jesus. In fact, the traditions that the Gospels themselves were written by, specifically the folks of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is a 2nd century fiction. The original, what we can tell anyway, the original sort of sources were not attributed to anybody. All the Gospels then were written by these non-eyewitnesses, and these later sort of important names were attached to them after the fact. Excuse me. And the earliest of them we find in the New Testament, for instance, was written close to 40 years after the supposed death of Jesus. All right. Now, 3 of the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are collectively known as the Synoptic Gospels. This is because they share a certain narrative, a synopsis, you might say. In fact, they are pretty incestuous in how they steal from each other throughout their sort of literary history. We'll go over that in some detail, but the theory is, and this does hold a lot of water. You had, say, the author of one with a copy of the other, and basically just plagiarizing these kinds of texts, chunks of the text for their own purposes. Don't do that in your paper. That's bad. Very bad. Don't do what the gospel writers do when it comes to this stuff. Now the next section of text that comes up are a bunch of letters. So essentially we have written correspondence, mostly from one of the earlier missionaries of what we would call Christianity. And this is a dude named Paul. But even here, the material, of course, is a little unreliable, at least historically. Of the 13 letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul, only 7 were actually written by him. The others were composed in his name quite late after his death. Likewise, all the other New Testament letters attributed to characters like James, Peter, Jude, and John were not written by the people they were attributed to. Okay. Now, again, they weren't lying. They weren't trying to swipe ideas from somebody. This was a typical ancient technique in which you would, excuse me, you would say the point that you're trying to make, and you would ascribe it to a prestigious follower. So if I was a follower, say, of Plato, I would be like, yeah, I would write a letter because I think I'm a legit follower of Plato, but I would sort of sign his name to it as a way of showing how accurately I was following in his footsteps. And to be fair, you're riffing off somebody's name, so you're probably going to lend a certain element of prestige to your writing. So this is what happened when it comes to the New Testament, in particular when we have Paul. So there are 7 letters that most scholars, I would say pretty much all scholars, attribute to the Apostle Paul. We have Romans, Philippians, Galatians, Philemon, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and 1st Thessalonians. Now, there is something called the pastoral epistles. These are letters that people generally think there's no way they are connected to Paul. This is 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And then there's also Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and a letter called Letter of the Hebrews, which some scholars claim were written by Paul, but by and large, the consensus is that they certainly were not. They seem to be later, 2nd century takes of what Paul would perhaps have thought. All right? And again, I always find it really funny. We get these letters from Paul, and they clearly were not written with the intent of being part of a New Testament. They seem to be essentially the junk mail of some guy who was really interested in this figure of Jesus and how he could reform Judaism, and his sort of letters written to a variety of communities that he had established. So we don't actually get what, like a lot of it is he would write to them, they would write back, and then this letter that we have is him kind of replying and answering questions. So it's sort of like getting half of a phone conversation. We're only listening to 50% of one person on the line is listening to. So you get this sort of fragmented vision of what Paul was all about. Anyway, the next text that we have is something called the Acts of the Apostles. It is a so-called history or a mythic construction of how the Christian church, and I put that in singular because there was multiplicity of churches at the time, spread out from Jerusalem in sort of these concretic circles, and sort of grows out from the center to essentially encompass the world and set up shop in Rome. This, of course, is a mythic take. This is not how early Christianity spread throughout the Mediterranean world. And one thing I should also note is Acts, it was actually written by the same author who wrote Luke. They should be put together. They were written as sort of one coherent document, but during canonization, when the New Testament was being put together, they were broken up. They were separated. So you have Luke and Acts as sort of two different stories, I guess. But in a way, you should think about it as sort of part 1 and part 2. And there at the end, we have a text called Revelation. This is an apocalypse, an apocalyptic story that is part of a pretty common literary genre known as apocalypse. Essentially, what it talks about is how the end is going to be, how Jesus is going to come back. He's going to, kick butt and take names and fix a lot of how the world is broken. There's lots of beasts, lots of whores in red dresses, veiled language in which the author is clearly speaking, not so veiled, I guess, of the Roman Empire, of the author's context. Okay, so again, a lot of folks will see it as predictions of the future. I was sort of raised with that idea in mind, but the text, when you look at it, especially from the context of when it was written, how it was written, and sort of the genre of these kinds of texts, is clearly writing about current political crises in Judea, or wherever it happened, Patmos, the island of Patmos. So somebody who is Jewish, who believed that Jesus was a fulfillment or an important figure in Judaism, had decided to write this text as a way of critiquing the current Roman practice. So that's something we'll certainly suss into. Okay. Now, I should also point out that these sort of three artificial chunks that we've talked about are typical literary genres of the ancient world. I mean, letters, of course. Everybody writes letters. But there's a whole whack of non-Jewish, non-Christian acts. There's a whole whack of these gospels and apocalypses floating around the ancient world. Now, the point is that for folks reading this stuff and hearing it, these kinds of stories would have been familiar. This would have seemed like a common literary trope. In a way, it would be like how we look at something like a Twitter account as a common thing that people would do, or different kinds of literature. Like, when I pick up a sci-fi novel, I know what to expect. It's a science fiction novel. It's going to follow certain parameters. Same kind of thing happened with these texts. There was a certain way in which this stuff would have been formed. But my point here is that the history of the origins of Christianity, just like the other stories and all of these other traditions of antiquity, are mythically, religiously, ideologically meaningful stories, but generally speaking, and I'm going to say particularly when it comes to early Christianity, they are not factual history. So as I recounted, I'm not telling you what really happened. I'm telling you what the Christian New Testament describes as actually happening. And one of the questions we will be addressing as we work through this stuff is why this is how folks who cobbled the New Testament together quite late. The New Testament wasn't sort of codified until the 4th century, so close to 400 years after, 350, 400 after Jesus had apparently been alive. Why they wanted to have this narrative. What was behind their agenda for framing early Christian history in this way. Okay? And I should point out, and again, we will get to this as the class progresses, this narrative is not one that shows up in all the sources. Some it does for sure, but certainly not all of it. And the force of this narrative, the force of this sort of a Big Bang theory of Christianity, as I alluded to, comes from not just the texts themselves, but how they have been collected. And I think that's an important element that we need to establish. Okay. Now, at the center of this narrative, we have the character of Jesus, of course, and I use the term character very intentionally. The New Testament Gospels describe him as the Messiah, as the Son of God. It also portrays Jesus as someone who is Jewish, born either in Bethlehem, according to the Gospel of Matthew, or in the city of Nazareth, according to the Gospel of Luke. Now, as an adult, he apparently roamed around a region called Galilee at the northern end of present-day Israel, and he preached about the kingdom of God, how it has come, and as it turns out, he was also the kingdom of God. So there's a slight contradiction there. His followers, at least, think he is something called the Messiah. And by the way, the term Christ isn't his last name. It simply just means Messiah, but in Greek. Okay, so sort of the Greek transliteration of the word Messiah. Essentially, that means God's anointed one. Now, according to the story, Jesus goes to Jerusalem around about the year 30 CE or so to celebrate Passover. And while he was there, he was arrested and crucified. However, this is where things kind of get a little interesting. He is executed and died on a Friday, was buried in a tomb, but on Sunday morning he was raised by God from the dead. Now, some women that were affiliated with the ministry, according to the story, they go to the tomb, find that his body has disappeared, and there's an angel telling him that he has been raised from the land, or raised back into the land of the living. They tell Jesus' original followers, and then Jesus himself appears to them to explain his miraculous resurrection. Now, presumably after this, he is assumed up into heaven, where, according to the stories, he remains to this day. And the act of God raising Jesus from the dead, by the way, is referred to as a resurrection. Now, anyway, the followers of Jesus conclude from the resurrection not only that Jesus was indeed the Messiah after all, but that the messianic salvation he offered was precisely not one against, say, political power, the Roman Empire, what have you, but it was victory over death. All right? So in other words, Jesus' death and resurrection showed that the whole point of Jesus was to take on death himself and to vanquish it. And so Christians who have faith that Jesus was the Messiah will, somehow or another, have eternal life, either by being raised bodily from the grave at the end of time, or by going to heaven to be with God when they die, or both. There's different conflicting views depending on the text that you look at. Now again, as I want to stress that this basic story is very misleading historically. What actually happened is that this limited view of Jesus in the New Testament, while found in the same collection, actually developed over a period of hundreds of years, or at least 100 years, and developed gradually and not consistently. Many Christian writings portray Jesus as vastly different than how this sort of traditional account would have us believe, with very different agendas. But the New Testament sort of presents it as though it happened all at once. Jesus died on Friday, and by Sunday we have a brand new religion, which happens to be called Christianity. And this is the power, I think, of the New Testament, because it is understood as sort of the quote-unquote best representation of our sources, and at times the only one. This variety is either ignored within the text or understood to be kind of fringy or not really central to what is going on. But this was certainly not the case in the ancient world. That might be an appropriate interpretive stance, say from the modern perspective, but from the ancient world, that simply doesn't hold a lot of water. Okay? And many of the literatures we will look at within the New Testament, they're kind of presented as being the most popular, the most accurate texts that sort of show what was going on with early Christianity, but that's not necessarily the case. For instance, the Gospel of Mark, for instance, the second Gospel within the New Testament canon, seems to have stopped being used around the 2nd century. People stopped kind of paying attention to it, referring to it. But other texts that we'll look at in the class, such as the Apocryphon of John, not the Apocalypse, but the Apocryphon of John. And there's a figure whose texts do not survive, but who does figure quite largely in early Christian history. His name is Marcion. Seem to have flourished, seem to have been incredibly popular, yet they do not show up in the canon. Okay? And as I alluded to before, it wasn't until the 4th century that the New Testament, as we have it now, became the standard. It became sort of the template in which folks were supposed to think about early Christianity. Or I should say, it was forced upon them. We had a small group of elite Christians who had decided that these were going to be the only texts for Christians to be appropriately Christian. Of course, others disagreed, but that is not necessarily how it worked out. So anyway, after this long rambling introduction, what I am hoping to get across now is that the reason we are not just looking, say, at the New Testament, or even in the order in which that is presented within the canon itself, or even looking at it as a coherent whole, is that this collection was cobbled together over a long period of time and really wasn't given authority until quite late, with a very specific agenda in mind. Okay, so that's something I want you to consider as well, up until around the 4th century. So it really is not representative of what Christians, or the people we call Christians, were doing and thinking and writing about during the first few centuries, or at least it doesn't encompass everybody. Or even if it is collected in the New Testament, the way it has been framed is kind of misleading. It's sort of been spun, or spin doctor has sort of got a hold of it to change a lot of the tenor of how it was done. And that's something I want us to think about when we suss through this material, okay? So my hope here anyway is to try, or at least to have tried, to denaturalize the New Testament so we can kind of look at each of the texts in their own light and their own canon, and not via this filter of it being part of the New Testament or the Bible or any of those kinds of things. So the idea we're going to do then is we're going to look at each individual source, or clumps of sources, kind of look at them within their context, and then at the end of the class we will hopefully have a sense of not just the literature that composed the New Testament, but how that literature came to be what it is. Okay, that's the first lecture for now. I will upload the second half of this relatively quickly. So yes, I hope that was as painless as possible, and we will be talking to everybody soon. Okay, take care.